300 cycles after Nova Helios was erased from the stars, a ghost ship tore through the black, unannounced, uninvited, unstoppable. It carried no crew, no insignia, only vengeance and a name whispered like a curse. Oblivion's wake. The galaxy had forgotten its sins. Kale Strath was here to remind them. The stars shifted slightly through the massive viewport of the Oblivion's wake. Silence ruled the bridge, broken only by the steady hum of old but over-engineered systems and the low, near-mournful ping of long-range sensors. The hull creaked like a sleeping beast, stretching its spine. Everything else, the pilot's breathing, the captain's heartbeat, the ghosts of the past, was quiet. Commander Kyle Strath stood alone at the helm. No crew, no AI support, just him and the last warship built by Nova Helios's now vanished military-industrial juggernaut. The Oblivion's wake wasn't sleek like the Dominion Ascendancy's vessels. It was a floating cathedral of armor, plating pulse cannons and dark silent threat. Ugly by galactic standards, brutal by design, and it was moving toward the border, crossing into Imperial space in 30 seconds. Kale whispered to no one but himself. His voice sounded like gravel, soaked in old blood. Showtime. The screen lit up with a dozen pings, Imperial sensor buoys, automated warning systems, defensive satellites locking in. The usual automated chatter followed standard threat assessments, red-coded warnings, and a final message from the Imperial border. AI unregistered warship halt. Identify immediately. This is restricted space. Kale didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and watched, just watched. The Oblivion's wake did not stop. It didn't need to. By the time the Dominion Ascendancy's border command realized the ship wasn't bluffing, it had already crossed the threshold. No cloaking, no stealth drive. It wasn't trying to sneak in, it wanted to be seen. Across Imperial space, alarm klaxons sounded in deep echoing waves. Hundreds of border stations began to scramble. Fleet commanders were called out of their sleep chambers. One elderly strategist vomited when he saw the name of the ship that had entered their territory. The Oblivion's wake. The name hadn't been spoken aloud in decades, not since the Nova Helios collapse, not since the fall of Draco's rift, not since the entire United Council of Systems vanished in stellar collapse and orbital ash. Most of the galaxy believed humanity was extinct, destroyed in their own war with themselves. They were half right. The humans were gone, but their monsters lived on. Kyle Strath wasn't here on a diplomatic mission. He wasn't a remnant of a lost race seeking peace or mercy. He was here for one thing, retribution. The Dominion Ascendancy had watched humanity die. They'd embargoed Nova Helios during its collapse, stripped colonies for resources, and whispered propaganda into the ears of allies until every Outer Rim nation turned its back. And when the last human signal went dark, the Dominion Ascendancy toasted its fall. Kale remembered. Because he had been there deep under Mars inside a forgotten military AI vault, frozen in cryo for 300 solar cycles, before waking to a galaxy that had erased his people like dust swept under a mat. Now he was back, and his warship remembered too. As the Oblivion's wake pushed deeper into Imperial space, entire fleets were mobilized, but none dared to engage. Not yet. Not without orders, not without reinforcements. Because the ship wasn't just a war machine. It was a warning. And Kale, he wasn't a survivor. He was a sentence one that started with fire. Inside the command deck of the Imperial Fortress world. Tarsus Fowl, Admiral Kelrin Vike stared at the screen with dry, unblinking eyes. Behind him, aides shouted, officers panicked, but he heard nothing except the pounding of his own pulse. It's a bluff. One of the strategists stammered. A relic, just one ship. No. Kelrin whispered, not that ship. He stood ancient bones aching under the weight of memory. That's the Oblivion's wake, the same ship that wiped out the Third Cyrix Armada in 6 minutes. The ship that glassed Valcorin with a single orbital strike. That ship doesn't bluff. He turned slowly, his eyes haunted. Nova, Helios didn't die. It's just been waiting. On the bridge of the Oblivion's wake, Kale looked down at a photo he kept tucked near the control panel, faded, nearly disintegrated. A woman, a boy, and a planet behind them. Nova Helios. Before the fall, he closed his eyes. Let's begin. The Oblivion's wake fired. The first volley from the Oblivion's wake wasn't a warning shot, it was judgment. 7 plasma-laced warheads ripped across Imperial space, leaving brilliant streaks of white-blue fire as they tore through the vacuum. They moved with impossible speed, dancing around the automated defense grids like they knew exactly where every satellite, every interceptor drone, and every failsafe was hidden. Because they did know. Kale had fed the ship's ancient targeting systems a full tactical map of Imperial defenses, maps stolen from the Krython archives decades before Nova Helios fell. And the Oblivion's Wake's algorithms had been evolving since then, learning adapting running simulations in silence. It wasn't just a ship, it was a veteran of a war that never ended. The warheads found their targets with brutal precision. 3 border stations vanished in incandescent bursts of heat and light, their debris scattering like ash over dead moons. A fleet yard orbiting Xerxes Prime was carved in 2 before its hangar bays could even open. A signal relay node, once used to monitor 8 sectors, was reduced to floating slag in seconds. And that was just the beginning. Across the Dominion Ascendancy, chaos erupted. Command networks choked with emergency pings. Civilians on fringe worlds began to riot at the news that a human ship, a real one, had crossed the veil. Some laughed in disbelief. Others screamed in dread. Children born long after Nova Helios's fall asked their parents what a Helian warship was. And those who remembered went silent. Inside the Imperial Overseer chamber, panic was disguised as diplomacy. Noble houses demanded immediate action, while border lords sent encrypted messages begging for reinforcements. Or forgiveness. At Fortress World, Tarsus V Admiral Thale Corrin stood over a 3-dimensional model of the invasion route. He didn't blink, didn't breathe. "Get me Grand Strategist Elleran," he said through gritted teeth. Now, his communications officer paled. "Sir, she's on Veskar 4 for the Treaty Summit. Then wake her up, tell her the past has come back to burn us." On the other side of the conflict, Kale sat alone in the bridge of the Oblivion's Wake, eyes reflecting the fires blooming across his screen. Not a twitch of emotion passed over his face. His fingers hovered above the controls, methodically adjusting course and speed, avoiding patrol routes before they could react. The Oblivion's Wake didn't need to dodge. It dared them to strike first. The Dominion Ascendancy had expected a slow incursion, maybe pirates, maybe a scavenger from the old Nova Helios fleets. But this was deliberate, coordinated, surgical. The Oblivion's Wake wasn't on a suicide run. It was on a mission, and every second it remained inside Imperial space sent a message. "You should have finished the job." A flash on the tactical readout snapped Kale from his thoughts. 3 Imperial corvettes had broken formation near the Niven corridor. Young, fast ships, new generation, likely crewed by fresh officers hoping to earn glory by striking down the last of the human ghosts. He smiled without warmth. "Let's see if they know who they're chasing." He angled the Oblivion's Wake sharply into a cloud of asteroid debris, old mining territory. He cut all emissions, letting the ship drift for 20 seconds before pulsing a single low-frequency signal, a breadcrumb, a trap. As expected, the corvettes followed. The first 2 entered the field at full burn, confident, reckless. The third hesitated, slowed just enough to realize something was off. By then, it was too late. The debris field erupted. Cluster mines, hundreds of them embedded in the asteroids, coded to human biosignatures and triggered by proximity, detonated all at once. The first corvette vanished in a flash. The second screamed as its hull split open, venting crew into space. The third tried to turn away, but a single graviton spike turret slug from the Oblivion's Wake's side battery punched through its spine and left it spinning in silence. 3 ships gone. 15 seconds. Kale exhaled slowly. The ghosts were screaming louder now, not literal ones. He wasn't insane, not fully, but they were always there, whispering in the hum of the engines and the flickering lights. His crew long dead, his family lost on Earth. His commander vaporized at the fall of Draco's rift. And still, they followed him. "I'm not done yet," he muttered. A sudden ping, incoming communication, encrypted but human standard protocol, one so old it shouldn't exist anymore. He froze. No one was supposed to know that encryption. No one was supposed to remember. He opened the channel, the screen flickered and a voice broken and familiar whispered through. "Kale, is that really you?" The voice hit Kale like a missile to the gut, unexpected, sharp, and impossible to ignore. He froze. For a moment, the bridge of the Oblivion's Wake fell deathly quiet. No alarms, no pings, just that broken static-laced whisper echoing from the comm system. "Kale, is that really you?" The voice was distorted, cracked like it had traveled through decades of silence, but the tone underneath it was unmistakable. Nera Voss. Kale's breath caught. He hadn't heard that name, or that voice, in over 300 solar cycles, not since the day the sky over Earth turned black and Draco's rift fell in a wave of nuclear flame. She'd been a tactician then, second in command of the Arclight Vanguard. She was smarter than anyone else in the room, colder too, but she had always been loyal, always honest, and she had died. Or so he thought. Kale leaned closer to the console, hesitating before speaking. His voice, when it came, was a growl dipped in disbelief. "Nera Voss. How the hell are you alive?" Silence. Then the voice came again, clearer this time, less static, more human. "Same way you were the cold, the dark. We were both buried under the ashes of a dying world, but unlike you, I didn't stay buried willingly." His fingers tightened on the console. "Where are you?" A pause. A sharp inhale. "Inside Imperial space, deep inside. They captured me during the collapse. I've been repurposed." She said the word like it tasted like acid. Kale could hear the venom in her tone, the layers of trauma behind that one simple phrase. "I fed them lies for years, misinformation, twisted reports. I've been sabotaging them from the inside piece by piece, and when I saw your signal, I knew you'd come back. I just didn't know if you'd still be you. I'm still me," he said flatly, "and I'm not here for rescue missions. I'm here to finish what they started." Another pause. "Then let me help." He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. He'd spent the last decade trusting no one, not even the ship. And now, out of nowhere, one of the last people who knew him before the fall just happens to be alive, operating from inside the Dominion Ascendancy. Too convenient, but it also explained a lot. The way the defense systems had been slower than expected, the strategic gaps in their response. He'd assumed it was incompetence, maybe it was sabotage. "Prove it," he said. There was a beat of silence. Then she transmitted something, a data package. Tiny, encrypted in human military code from the old Nova Helios fleet, something no one outside of the Krython vaults should have had access to. Kale ran it through the Oblivion's Wake's decryption system. The file opened. What he saw made his blood run colder than cryo. A list of Imperial targets, high-ranking officers, research stations, weapon depots, civilian centers quietly supplying the war machine. And one name highlighted at the very top, Admiral Kelrin Corrin. Kale's eyes narrowed. "I know that name," he murmured. Eliara's voice came through again, harder now. "You should." He signed the order that doomed the Arclight Vanguard, the one that left us to die. He's not just a target Strath, he's the architect, and now he's the only thing standing between you and the heart of the Dominion Ascendancy. Kale stood slowly, letting the words settle. Kelrin Corrin, the man who'd ordered Nova Helios to be cut off, who'd chosen silence over salvation, who'd watched billions burn from the safety of his orbital palace. He wasn't just another name, he was the reason Kale still woke up screaming. The comms crackled again, softer this time. "He's at Karen's Reach, the capital Citadel fortress. You'll never reach him without help. And what, you're just gonna guide me there? I already have checked your nav grid." Kale did a new route, had been uploaded, slower, riskier, but it avoided most of the patrol routes, slipping through mining tunnels, forgotten smugglers' corridors, and gas fields where sensors failed. "You're insane," he muttered. "And you're alive," she snapped. "We don't get to be sane anymore, Kale. We're relics in a galaxy that tried to erase us. But if we want the Dominion Ascendancy to bleed, we do it together." Kale stared at the flickering console, the stars moving slowly outside the viewport. He didn't trust her, but he hated them more. He tapped the nav console, course locked, heading for Karen's Reach. The Oblivion's Wake turned, slowly disappearing into a field of drifting ice and silent gas, its weapons humming like wolves sharpening teeth. And in the capital Citadel world, deep inside the throne room of a planet carved from stone and steel, High Marshal Thale Corrin received the report. His aides trembled as they delivered it. "The Oblivion's Wake has changed course. It's coming straight for you." Corrin didn't flinch. He simply stood slowly as the firelight glinted off his metals. "So it begins." The journey to Karen's Reach was a descent into the Dominion Ascendancy's forgotten veins. Paths not meant for warships, let alone one carrying the wrath of a dead planet. The Oblivion's wake moved like a ghost through old mining tunnels beneath the surface of Lornak 3, a fractured moon that once fueled the Dominion Ascendancy's earliest expansion. Its tunnels, now abandoned, ran like arteries under crumbling stone, too narrow for capital ships, too forgotten to be monitored. And yet Kale's ship glided through her engines, whisper-quiet, hole-scraping ancient rock, as if the planet itself had forgotten how to scream. The route Naira Voss had uploaded was working. So far, Coyle didn't like it. He'd trusted no one, for years survived by doubting every voice but his own. Yet, here he was, following a path laid out by a woman he'd last seen 300 solar cycles ago on a burning station, now claiming to be alive and embedded in the Dominion Ascendancy's core. Every sensor sweep, every flicker of static made his fingers twitch toward the trigger. But the Oblivion's wake obeyed without question. Silent, focused, hungry. It remembered the Dominion Ascendancy, and it wanted to be let off the leash. The deeper they went, the more signs he saw of decay, entire Imperial outposts buried in dust, emergency beacons blinking aimlessly in the dark. Dead drones floated like corpses outside shattered airlocks. The mighty empire, it seemed, had roots as rotten as its crown. Kale recorded everything, sent bursts of data into the net. The Oblivion's wake's black box still held a pulse beacon encrypted undetectable to most scans. Naira Voss was supposed to be receiving it whether she was or not. He couldn't be sure. Halfway through a dense gas belt near the heart of the Eridan sector, the ship's motion sensors tripped. Something was following him. He brought up the rear display. Faint readings, small, fast. 2 ships, then 3, then 4. Sleek Imperial signatures. They'd found him. Stealth patrols, he muttered, lips thinning. They're learning? He didn't panic. The Oblivion's wake was old, but age meant experience. Experience meant scars and weapons. He powered down active systems, reduced heat emissions, and drifted, allowing the thick mist of the belt to swallow the ship whole. Through the viewport, glowing red shadows flitted past. The Empire's new class scout ships, equipped with phased thrusters and cryo-cloak overlays, moved like sharks around a sleeping beast. They didn't see him yet. Kale reached slowly to the side panel and activated the magnetic launch port's no targeting system. No lock on pure analog, a move from a forgotten war. He fired. The mines released silently, dozens of them, drifting behind him like sleeping fireflies. He waited, and when the scouts looped around for a scan, they detonated. The explosion was blinding in the gas field, lighting up the whole belt like lightning in a storm. One ship evaporated instantly, another spun out venting fluid and screaming metal. The others scattered, but Kale was already gone, diving into a narrow crevice in the asteroid cluster below. The old trick still worked, but now the Dominion Ascendancy would know exactly where he was headed. No more secrets. He emerged from the field on the other side, sensors roaring as dozens, no hundreds of signals began moving across Imperial space, converging. The news had spread. The Oblivion's wake was coming for Karen's reach, and nothing was stopping it now. He opened communications. Naira Voss, he called out there on alert, were past subtle. Her voice returned almost instantly, tense, controlled. Then you better move faster. You've got about 12 hours before Bastion launches its planetary shields. I'll be there in 6, a brief pause. You always were insane, and you always had a death wish, he snapped back. But his tone lacked venom. It was something else, familiarity, resentment, maybe even trust. He closed the channel and leaned forward. The capital wasn't just a fortress, it was a statement, a planet wrapped in armor, orbiting a neutron star with enough firepower to erase continents. Even with Naira Voss's intel, getting close would be suicide, which was fine. He hadn't come here to live. He'd come to make them remember what it meant to fear Nova Helios. As the Oblivion's wake punched through the final outer checkpoint, triggering every alarm within 100,000 kilometers, Kale stared at the blinking dot that marked his target. High Marshal Thalie Corin, the butcher of Arclight Vanguard, the man who watched Nova Helios burn and called it strategy. Kale whispered to the ship like it was alive. Let's finish this. The Oblivion's wake surged forward, and Karen's reach prepared for a war it thought it would never have to fight again. The approach to Karen's reach wasn't subtle. It wasn't supposed to be. The Oblivion's wake dropped out of warp just outside the gravity well of the capital world, its hull screaming against the force of re-entry. Plasma scorched its sides as it sliced through the upper atmosphere, like a blade dragged across glass. Every orbital cannon within range opened fire, but the Oblivion's wake didn't dodge. It charged straight through anti-ship missiles, streaked across the sky, but the ship's old auto-defense grid activated in a blinding flash, graviton-spiked turrets snapping into motion, intercepting projectiles mid-flight, with a precision that felt like sorcery to the watching Imperial officers. The ancient Helian targeting algorithms were a century old, but they were still years ahead of anything the Dominion Ascendancy had. One of the Dominion Ascendancy's orbital defense platforms got bold moving in to intercept. Kale didn't even blink. He fired the ventral lance cannon. A beam of white-hot energy screamed across the void and hit the platform dead center. There was no explosion, just a flash of light. And then, nothing. The structure collapsed in on itself, imploding before it had the chance to die with dignity. On the surface of Quarren's Reach, cities darkened. Sirens blared. The planetary shield began to rise, layers of shimmering energy slowly engulfing the capital citadel. Citizens looked to the sky and saw what their parents had warned them about in bedtime horror stories. A lone human warship. They used to mock the phrase. Now it was prophecy. Inside the command citadel, Admiral Kelrin Volk stood before a massive hollow display, his arms behind his back, his face unreadable. Around him, panic reigned. General shouted, officers pleaded, security personnel called for evacuation of the Overseer Chamber Quarter. He said nothing. He watched. He remembered the last time he'd seen that ship through a satellite feed above the burning orbit of Draco's Rift. He remembered the Arclight Vanguard cornered begging for support, and he remembered denying it. He told himself then that Nova Helios was a failed experiment, that the human hunger for war would collapse in on itself, and the galaxy would be better off for it. But the Oblivion's wake had survived, and now it had come for him. Admiral, a young aide, stammered, eyes wide with terror. "We must retreat to the planetary core." "Hold your post," Vox said quietly. "But sir," I said, "hold your post." The aide froze. Vec turned toward the nearest tactical officer. "Status on the shield, 65%. Full activation in 5 minutes. Then we have 5 minutes to kill it." Back in orbit, Kale guided the Oblivion's wake with the calm precision of a man already dead inside. The ship had taken damage. Its port thrusters sputtered. Half the rear cannons were offline. But it didn't matter. He wasn't planning on flying home. He focused his attention on the city beneath him. Centra Domina, the seat of Imperial power. The same city that had ordered the embargo on Nova Helios. The same city that celebrated its death. He marked 3 locations: the Defense Ministry, the Overseer Chamber Vaults, and the primary Neurocore Citadel. He would raise them all, but just as he prepared the firing sequence, the comms sparked again. Naira Voss's voice. "Kale, you need to know something. They're moving civilians into the Nexus Tower." He froze. "What they're using it as a shield, thousands of them, non-military, mostly children and workers." He stared at the screen. The targeting reticle blinked over the tower, already charged, already primed. His jaw clenched. The Dominion Ascendancy hadn't changed. It still hid behind the innocent, still used lives like tools. He could fire anyway, make his statement finish the mission. But at what cost? The silence on the bridge was suffocating. The ghosts whispered louder now. Voices of the Helix dead, his crew, his sister, the people the Dominion Ascendancy erased. They cried for vengeance, but one voice cut through them all. Naira Voss's. "Don't become what they said we were. Don't give them that." Kale cursed under his breath. His hand hovered over the fire controls. And then he did something no one expected. He redirected the payload. He targeted the old military spire to the East Vox personal estate. The man had built it as a monument to victory over Earth. Arrogant, opulent, thick with security, but no civilians. He fired. The sky split open. A lance of light tore through the clouds and slammed into the spire with the weight of an angry god. The explosion rocked the capital citadel. Fire bloomed across the horizon, and a shockwave shattered windows for miles. The estate was gone. Nothing left but molten steel and ashes. In the command citadel, Admiral Vox stared at the smoldering crater on the screen. For the first time in decades, his face cracked, his jaw tightened, his hand trembled. He spared the civilians, one officer whispered. "He's not here for conquest," another muttered. "He's here for you." Vox said nothing, because he knew. And somewhere beneath the surface, buried in the labyrinth of the capital citadel's underbelly, a figure in a stolen uniform keyed open a hidden service hatch and emerged into the city's heart. Nira Voss was on the move, and Kale was about to land. The Oblivion's wake came down like a fallen god. Its engines roared against the skies of Karen's Reach, shaking the buildings below as people ran, screamed, or simply stood frozen beneath the shadow of history returned. The ship didn't dock. It impaled itself into the city's core sector, crushing half a security tower beneath its reinforced hull and sending a thunderous ripple through the capital citadel's foundation. And then the silence came. Not peace. The kind of silence that settles in a graveyard just before a storm breaks. Kale Stroth stepped out of the ship like a reaper made flesh. The air was thick with smoke and ash. Sirens blared in the distance. The Imperial military had pulled back from the area, unsure if this was a single-man incursion or the first wave of something worse. But Kale didn't care. He didn't need backup, didn't need an army. He was the army, clad in old Helian battle armor, scarred half-painted more patchwork than regulation. He moved through the streets like a walking obituary. Civilians scattered at the sight of him. The boldest few tried to film, but their hands trembled too much to keep the feed steady. Everyone had heard of the Oblivion's wake. No one had expected to see the man who flew it. Kale checked his HUD. Nira Voss's signal blinked faintly 3 clicks east, moving fast. She was deep inside the infrastructure tunnels beneath the Imperial Council building. Good. That meant she was inside the belly of the beast, and it meant he had an opening. He crossed through the city like a ghost, past shattered statues of Imperial war heroes, past propaganda screens still spitting anti-human rhetoric, warning the public of Helian resurrection threats. He smiled bitterly. They still didn't get it. This wasn't resurrection. This was retribution. At the edge of the council sector, resistance finally came. Elite guards, dozens armed with plasma spears, rail rifles, and combat drones, the Dominion Ascendancy's finest. They didn't speak, didn't threaten. They just formed a wall and raised their weapons. Kale stopped 20 meters from them. He could have opened fire, could have called in a surgical strike from the Oblivion's wake still hovering above, but instead, he dropped his rifle, let it clatter to the ground. And then he spoke. "You think you're protecting something sacred?" he said, his voice echoing through the burned-out ruins. "But all you're guarding is a lie." No one moved. He took another step forward. "I don't want your city. I don't want your throne. I don't even want your lives." He pointed upward toward the smoldering remains of Admiral Vox estate, still glowing faintly in the ash-filled sky. "I want him! I want him!" The guards hesitated. A few glanced toward the council building behind them. One looked afraid. That's when the ground beneath them exploded. Elira emerged from the side tunnel in a flash. Plasma charges tearing open the pavement, sending several guards flying. She moved like lightning, a blur of motion, in stolen armor, laying down cover fire with one hand while flinging a thermal blade to Kale with the other. He caught it in one motion. The fight was chaos. Kale didn't shoot. He closed distance. He slammed into the first guard like a battering ram, crushing armor and bone with the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. The second he cut down with a single slash to the neck, sparks flying as the blade chewed through synth fiber plating. Elira was already past the wall, carving through drones with surgical precision, her face streaked with soot and blood. She wasn't fighting like someone trying to survive. She was fighting like someone trying to end something. The guards fell one by one until only silence remained. Kale stood in the rubble, panting, the blade dripping molten residue. He looked at Elira, older, harder, but still her. "Nice entrance," he muttered. She gave him a bloody grin. "You softened them up for me." He nodded once. Cor and she pointed to the building behind her. "Underground bunker AI protected. Last checkpoint is biometric, only opens to registered bloodlines." Kale's face hardened. "Then I'll open it with his." They didn't waste another second. They descended into the underlevels of the council building, ancient chambers, laced with gold-trimmed halls and lies engraved into every polished surface. It was a mausoleum of stolen glory. Every painting, every statue, a revisionist tribute to the Dominion Ascendancy's triumph over Nova Helios. Elira said nothing, but Kale saw the way her fingers twitched at her side. She remembered. They reached the final chamber, a thick door biometric lock. Kale stepped up, placed his palm on the scanner. Nothing. Access denied? Of course only Corrin's blood would open this. And the bastard was waiting below, watching, counting the seconds, no doubt arming every last defense he had. Kale turned to Illyra. No more subtlety. She smirked. Thought you'd never ask. They planted the charges, backed up, and lit the fuse. The explosion shook the chamber. Metal screamed. Systems fried. The door blew inward, and as the smoke cleared, Kale Stroth stepped through into the final sanctum where Admiral Kelrin Corrin waited with a pistol. A smirk and the eyes of a man who thought he still had control. The sanctum was colder than expected. Beneath the layers of gold, reinforced titanium, and empire-polished decor, it felt like a tomb. Quiet, bitter, and built for the man who thought he'd never have to face judgment. Admiral Kelrin Corrin stood at the far end of the chamber, framed by massive windows that showed the scorched skyline of Karen's Reach. Fires flickered in the distance, sirens wailed, and far above the silhouette of the Oblivion's wake still hovered unmoving, watching like a judge ready to pass sentence. Corrin didn't flinch. He held a sleek plasma pistol aimed straight at Kale. His uniform was immaculate metals pinned to his chest like trophies looted from the dead. "You look older," he said. Kyle stepped forward, the thermal blade still in his hand, his expression unreadable. "You look smaller." Corrin gave a hollow chuckle, still full of quips I'd forgotten how irritating Helians could be. Naira Voss moved to Kale's side, weapon raised. "Drop the gun, Kelrin, it's over." The Admiral shook his head slowly. "No, you don't get to tell me when it's over. I built this empire. I sacrificed billions to keep it from descending into chaos. And now, what you come here with your relic of a ship, your vengeance fantasies thinking you'll erase me and history will remember you." Kale said nothing, just took another step forward. Corrin's finger tightened on the trigger. "You don't understand the weight of command," he snapped. "You never did. I watched Earth eat itself alive. You want to know what I saw in those final transmissions? Madness, cannibalism, stellar collapse, your people deserved extinction." Kale's voice was calm, but low enough to cut through steel. "My people deserved help, not abandonment." "You were already dead," Corrin hissed. "I just made the call to stop wasting resources on a corpse." "And now the corpse is walking," Naira Voss muttered. Corrin's eyes flicked to her, burning with contempt. "You were the worst of them, a traitor feeding us lies. Do you think I didn't know you kept us blind for years? You let this happen." Naira Voss smirked, stepping forward, shoulder to shoulder with Kale. "Then, maybe you should have killed me instead of using me." Kale raised his blade slowly. "You had your war, you had your empire, now it's time for your reckoning." Corrin's pistol fired a single shot, fast, precise, but not fast enough. Kale shifted the tri-phased arc shot, grazing his shoulder, but not stopping him. He crossed the space between them in a blur, grabbed the Admiral by the throat, and slammed him against the reinforced window behind him. The pistol clattered to the ground. Cole held the blade to Corrin's chest. "You left us to die. I saved the galaxy. You saved your legacy." Corrin spat blood into Kale's face. "I saved them from you, from the Helian plague. You think this ends with my death? You think the people won't hunt you to the edges of space?" Kyle leaned closer, voice like thunder muffled in frost. "I don't care what happens after I didn't come for justice. I came to end you." But just before he drove the blade in, he stopped, his eyes narrowed. Because killing Corrin here, just another dead tyrant and another hidden bunker, was too easy, too clean. He wanted more than blood, he wanted truth. He yanked the Admiral forward, slammed him onto a control console, and activated the live transmission panel. It linked to every major broadcast tower in the Dominion Ascendancy. Emergency override, the screen lit up. Across Karen's Reach and across the outer sectors, people stopped what they were doing as an unauthorized message crackled into existence. And they saw him. Kale Stroth, the last Helian war commander, standing over the man who betrayed Nova Helios. "This is a message to the Dominion Ascendancy," he said, voice steady, cold, absolute. This man, High Marshal Thale Corrin, signed the order that condemned an entire civilization. He watched Nova Helios fall, he called it a mercy, and he thought the dead wouldn't return. He dragged Corrin's face into view, bloodied, broken, terrified. "They told you we were monsters. The Helians were violent, unstable, dangerous. They used our extinction to build their power." He paused. "I'm not here to rule you. I'm not here to replace the Dominion Ascendancy." He stared into the camera, into the galaxy. "I'm here to remind you, You can only bury the truth for so long before it comes digging out of the grave. He ended the transmission. Corin screamed and tried to break free, but Kale shoved him back with one hand blade inches from his heart. "You want the legacy, you'll have it," Kale said. "The whole Empire just watched you break. That's your legacy now." The coward who created a lie so big, it brought the past back to kill him. Corin snarled, "You won't make it out of this city." Wasn't planning to. Kale drove the blade into his chest. Corin's body slumped finally still. Elira stepped back, exhaling slowly. "It's done," she whispered. "No," Kale said, looking towards the sky. "It's only beginning." The death of Admiral Kelrin Corin did not end the Dominion ascendancy. It unmasked it. Across Karen's reach, the signal Kyle sent out couldn't be stopped. The override had been hard-coded into the Oblivion's Wake's AI decades ago, a failsafe for lost wars, designed not to win, but to expose. And that's exactly what it did. The people didn't rise in cheers, there was no sudden revolution. Instead, there was silence, the kind that stretches across a crowd when a lie finally dies and no one knows what to say. Corin's face beaten and trembling, replayed over and over on every screen. His screams, his last words, the moment the blade entered his chest. Everything, and Kale Strath standing over him like death returned from exile. Imperial citizens across 100 systems stared in horror, not at the Helian warship, but at the truth, that their leaders had built their shining empire atop bones. That Earth had not fallen from madness, but had been pushed. Some tried to spin it. High Lords claimed it was a fake transmission, that it was propaganda. But the military logs that Naira dumped into the public grid, signed orders, recorded meetings, intercepted communications, were undeniable. The Empire had orchestrated Earth's extinction, and the last human warship had come back to make sure they never forgot. Kale stood in the ruins of the bunker, staring at the blood pooling beneath Corin's corpse. The tremors from the fight had started to collapse the upper levels. Fires burned above. The building would fall soon. He looked at Naira. She was leaning against a shattered console, one arm cradled against her chest, blood leaking from her side. "Still with me?" he asked. She gave him a tired smile. "Barely, but yeah." "Extraction?" She shook her head. "No way through the blockade. The Oblivion's Wake shields are almost gone." Kale nodded. He already knew. They weren't making it out, and that was fine. He turned toward the lift that led back to the surface. "We walk. One last time." Together they climbed out of the bunker. The city above was chaos, but it wasn't fighting. Not yet. Troops were disoriented. Leaders were silent. Civilians stared at them as they walked through the rubble. Two ghosts dragging themselves through a graveyard of lies. No one stopped them. At the extraction point near the old Senate walls, the Oblivion's Wake hovered low, engines failing, smoke pouring from its thrusters. She was dying. But like any old war beast, she'd waited until the mission was done. Kale stopped and looked up at her. His ship, his friend, his coffin. He turned to Naira. "You don't have to..." She cut him off with a glare. "If you think I came this far to let you die alone, you're dumber than I thought." They stepped inside the ship. The bridge was quiet, lights flickering, alarms silent now, like even the systems knew this was the end. Kale sat at the helm, one last time. His hands moved slowly over the controls, inputting the final sequence. A jump, not to escape, to bury the evidence. The Oblivion's Wake's reactor would overload at the center of Karen's Reach's outer defense ring, enough to fry every orbital cannon, every satellite, every warship on standby. No more retaliation. No more nukes. Just silence. "Final command," the ship's AI asked, voice worn and ancient. Kale looked at Naira. She nodded. "Execute." The ship rose, climbing through the smoke toward the clouds. Past the towers, past the walls, past the layers of the Dominion ascendancy that had survived on stolen memory. And then, in one final blaze of defiance, the Oblivion's Wake vanished into light. The explosion could be seen from every part of the capital citadel, a second sun, a funeral pyre, the last Hellion warship. Gone. In the days that followed, the Dominion ascendancy did not collapse, but it cracked. People began to question, to speak, to whisper the name Kale Reyes. Not with fear, but with reverence. Not because he brought death, but because he brought truth. Monuments fell. Archives were opened. The words Helian extinction were rewritten into Helian betrayal. Naira Voss's files spread like wildfire, and the Council fractured under the weight of too many covered lies. And in the dark corners of the galaxy where forgotten colonies still bore the DNA of Nova Helios, a signal echoed. We are not gone, we are not finished. We are human, and we remember.